Hello students, welcome to the channel. In this video, we'll solve the literature passage from the reading section of the March 2020 SAT. So let's begin. This passage is adapted from Helen Oyeyemi, The Icarus Girl. After a long journey from her home in England, 8-year-old Jessamy is meeting her mother's family in Nigeria for the first time. There they all stood, an uncertain circle, and then her grandfather came forward, greeted her mother, shook hands with her father. Although he seemed mellower and smaller than the picture that her mother had painted for her over the years, Jess had a sudden and irrational fear that he might start shouting at her. So the first paragraph sets the introduction where Jess, along with her mother and father, has traveled to Nigeria to her mother's family. And here she is being introduced to her grandfather, her maternal grandfather. And even though he seems mellower and smaller in person than the impression that she has of him, based on what her mother has told her, she has this irrational fear that, he would shout at her. And this is perhaps because of the picture of this strict person that her mother has made for her. He looked at her, put his hands on his hips in mock consternation, and her cousins and her mother laughed. Her father, standing slightly outside the circle, smiled encouragingly at her. Her grandfather held out a hand. His hands were big and square, spade-like, the palms deeply edged and calloused. She took a step towards him, smiling a wobbly, nervous smile that she could not feel on her face. So this paragraph is really about them coming face to face, and the mother and the cousins are around, and the grandfather puts forth a hand to shake her hand. And the father, because this is the mother's family, the father is outside the circle, but he's still looking at Jess encouragingly. She did not know what was expected of her. She had nearly reached him when suddenly, on an outward gust of air, he half said, half announced a name, Vorola. Who? She froze, not knowing what to say or do. Of course, she knew that Vorola was her Yoruba name, the name that her grandfather had asked in a letter for her to be called when her mother had held her Nigerian naming ceremony. Vorola means gold. So this is sort of the first indication of the distance, the metaphorical distance between Jess and her grandfather. The grandfather is in Nigeria and he calls her by a name that Jess is not used to, because back home in Britain, she is called Jess, while her Nigerian name is Vorola, which means gold. And so when she comes close to her granddad and he calls her Vorola, she freezes for a minute because she's not sure how to react to that name, because she doesn't really respond to that name, even though she knows it's her name. She knew all this, but nobody had ever called her Vorola, not even her mother, whom she could now see from the corner of her eye, making anxious, silent gestures for her to go to her grandfather. Here in this stone-walled corridor where the sunlight came in through enormous stiff mosquito screens over every window, and her clothes clung to her like another skin, Vrola sounded like another person, not her at all. So the reason the author has italicized knew here is to say that, she knew this. This was something that was known to her. She knew the fact that, her Nigerian name is Vorola. But knowing something and being comfortable with something are two different things, right? And because she had never been to Nigeria before, all of these things were entirely new to her. And then even the setting, right? This setting gives us Nigeria's climate, which is hot and humid. So her clothes clung to her like another skin, and which is very different from a temperate country like Britain. So it was not just the setting, it was not just the fact that she was meeting her mother's family for the first time, but the very place, the very region that she was now visiting was new to her. Should she answer to this name and by doing so steal the identity of someone who belonged here? Should she become Vurola, but how? So this encapsulates her doubts, right? Could she really become Vurola? Could she become this Nigerian girl that everybody around her expected to be, even though she had never been to Nigeria before? She could not make herself move forward, so she stayed where she was, avoided his touch, looked up into her grandfather's face, smiled and said quietly but firmly in her most polite voice, "Hello, grandfather." After they had taken baths and Jess had been made to eat a little, her mother disappeared with her youngest sister, Auntie Bayola, and her father befriended Uncle Kanle, who was clearly as newspaper minded as he was and wanted to talk about politics. Swiftly dropping a kiss onto her forehead, her father released her into her grandfather's clutches before mounting the stairs that led up to the roof balcony of the house. Okay, so now the action shifts to a more private meeting between the grandfather and Jess. When they first met, when they were introduced, this was in a public place in the sense that the mother's extended family and Jess's father, everyone was around. And it was a very formal sort of introduction, right? They didn't really exchange much except for pleasantries. But now the family had dispersed, and the father also decided to spend some time with one of the uncles, and he kind of, not pushed, but he kind of, sent Jess to spend time with the grandfather. So her grandfather did have a face. It was a broad lined face. The smile and frown lines ran deep into his skin, his eyes made smaller by the loosened flesh around them. He had the same wide, strong jawline with the determined set as her mother and the same prominent cheekbones, although Jess could see that his were made angular more through the emaciation of age than anything else. He was quite short and moved about very quickly. Okay, so this is in fact the first time that she looks her grandfather in the face, because when they met earlier, she had just seen his hand, right? And she notices a number of things. He was an old man, so the frown lines ran deep into his skin. He had a strong jawline, which reminded Jess of her mother, but he was also emaciated with age. To be emaciated is to be the right meaning would be malnourished, but I don't think that would work here. I think here it would mean that somebody who is extremely slim and extremely gaunt. So yeah, so that's what it would mean here. So this is when she meets him for the first time. As Jess sat in the parlor, keeping very still so that she wouldn't take up much space on the brown and white sofa, she allowed herself to stare openly and seriously at her grandfather, and he did the same. She felt as if she were a little piece of him that had crumbled off, maybe, which he was examining for flaws and broken bits before deciding whether it was worth taking it to be reattached. It was impossible to tell what he thought of her. So this is an interesting paragraph because you see that even though they are so intimately related, the maternal grandfather and Jess, they haven't really come face to face ever until now, right? In her 8 years of existence, Jess has never met her grandfather, and so now as they sit opposite each other, they are examining each other, right? And the author refers to this examination from Jess's perspective as though the grandfather was examining if a part of him had fallen off and whether that fallen part had any flaws and whether it was fit to be reattached. So in a way, it makes sense because it's a metaphor. It's a metaphor for the fact that Jess is she comes from the same bloodline as the grandfather, but at the same time she has never met him. She lives in a foreign country, so that part of being of having fallen off is meant to indicate that. She sat at a right angle from him, breathing out silence. He sat very upright. Like her, she noted with surprise, his hands on his knees, the crisp lines of his white shirt almost molding him, fixing him still in her sight. They were both waiting, supposedly, for her auntie Funk to bring them some soft drinks. Her grandfather had called them minerals, but really, Jessamy sensed that they were waiting to see if they would like each other or not. So, this passage ends on a somewhat positive, but also, uh, I would say, incomplete note, because we just know that they have met for the first time. How will their relationship develop? Would Jessamy have enough time to spend with her grandfather? Because obviously the family is visiting and they'll return. So it brings out this sort of dilemma, it brings out this sort of confusion, but it also brings out this idea of the strong bonds of family and how, even if separated by distance and time, those bonds stay. Okay, let's get to the questions. In using the phrase uncertain circle, the narrator most nearly means that the family members are. So, uncertain circle, this is here. There they all stood, an uncertain circle. And then her grandfather came forward, greeted her mother, shook hands with her father. So, I think uncertain here would refer to not being sure of what would happen, right? Because you notice that there is a sort of tension that builds in the passage in the beginning where they are not sure how this interaction between Jess and the grandfather would proceed. And particularly from Jess's perspective, she's quite circumspect in the beginning, right? So, yeah, so that's what uncertain circle could mean. The family members are disoriented after an unusually difficult journey. They are self conscious and tentative about interacting. They are openly suspicious of each other's motives, and they are dependent on one another for reassurance. So it would be B, right? Because we notice that they are meeting after a long time, and there is a degree of self consciousness and a degree of being tentative around one another. So the fact that they are disoriented, there is no evidence for that, right? There's no mention of the travel that they took and how difficult it was. So A is wrong. They are not suspicious of each other's motives. It's a family gathering, so there is no reason to be, and there's no evidence for that. And they're not dependent on one another for reassurance. You could say that they are to an extent, because Jess looks to her parents for reassurance, but that is not what uncertain circle means. Uncertain circle would mean that they're self conscious and tentative, right? So it's B. Okay, question 2. Based on the passage, which factor most decisively influences Jess's reaction to meeting her grandfather? Right, and this is evidence-based. So let's mark the lines 1 to 3, 3 to 7, 1 to 3, 3 to 7, 8 to 10, and 12 to 15. 8 to 10 and 12 to 15. So which factor influences Jess's reaction to meeting her grandfather? So there they all stood, an uncertain circle, and then her grandfather came forward, greeted her mother, and shook hands with her father. So it can't be this because Jess is not spoken of here. Although he seemed mellower and smaller than the picture that her mother had painted for her over the years, Jess had a sudden and irrational fear that he might start shouting at her. Yeah, so this could work because this factor of being scared because of the stories that her mother had painted, that was what influenced her initial meeting. Option C, he looked at her, put his hands on his hips in mock consternation, and her cousins and her mother laughed. Okay, so this is from the grandfather's perspective, not Jess. And his hands were big and square, spade like, the palms deeply etched and calloused. She took a step towards him, smiling a wobbly, nervous smile that she could not feel on her face. So, again, this is not about what impression she had of him, what factor could affect her meeting with the grandfather. This is something which talks about his physical attributes. So I like B. So let's look at the options. His intimidating physical presence and mannerisms, his indifference to other family members' attitudes towards him, her parents' concerns about being reunited with him, her mother's ominous descriptions of his temperament. So it has to be D, right? Because D connects directly with B, that her mother had painted an ominous picture of him. And that is something that was on Jess's mind when she met him. Okay, his intimidating physical presence and mannerisms don't really come across in the passage. So even here, if we say his hands were big and square, spade-like, the palms deeply etched and calloused, she took a step towards him, smiling a wobbly, nervous smile. So this is not to say that his presence was intimidating. This is just to say that, they were meeting for the first time and Jess was taking in all the details. The factor that affected her was what she had been told by her mother. So, yeah, so A is not correct. His indifference to other family members, there's no evidence for that. So B is not correct. Her parents' concerns about being reunited with him, again, there is no evidence for how, Jess thinks of that. So it's D. In the passage, the actions of Jess's father suggest that he, okay, is this, no, this is not evidence-based. So he is less sociable than are the other members of the family. He has an imperfect understanding of Nigerian culture. He advocates for Jess to choose her own name. He wishes to promote Jess's introduction to her grandfather. So I think the answer here would be D, because there are a number of places where he kind of wants Jess to meet her grandfather, right? For example, her father, standing slightly outside the circle, smiled encouragingly at her, right? So he was kind of telling her to go ahead and meet the grandfather. And even here, he swiftly dropped a kiss onto her forehead and released her into her grandfather's clutches. So in both cases, there is a sense that he wants to introduce Jess to her grandfather. There's no evidence that he is less sociable. There is a mention that he stands outside the circle, but that's probably because he is not part of that family in the sense that it's the maternal side of Jess's family. So it's not A. He has an imperfect understanding of Nigerian culture. There's no evidence for that. So it's not B. And the fact that he advocates for Jess to choose her own name, there's no mention of that again. We only know that Jess has a Nigerian name and an English name that she uses back home. So it's D. Based on lines 21 to 32, which choice best describes Jess's initial reaction to being addressed as Vurola? So lines 21 to 32 are here. She froze, not knowing what to say or do. So this is the part where she was not used to being called Vurola, right? Even though she knew that this was her Nigerian name. So, there was this sense that she had that she was kind of taking on somebody else's identity because that was not something that she recognized. So she resents that her Nigerian family insists on using the name. She recognizes the name but cannot recall its precise meaning in Yoruba. She's startled that her grandfather has remembered the name. She's aware that it is her name but is unable to acknowledge it as such. So it's D, right? She knows that Vurola is her Nigerian name, but she finds it hard to acknowledge this as her name, right? She does not resent that her family has chosen, right? There's no resentment. There's a confusion because she doesn't really relate to it. So this is wrong. She recognizes the name, and her confusion doesn't stem from the fact that she doesn't recognize or doesn't recall its meaning in Yoruba. That's not what it is. It is about not being able to relate to the name because it's not something that she's called. And she's not startled that her grandfather has remembered the name. That's not the reason for her surprise. The reason for her surprise is that she does not know how to react to it, right? So it's not C. Which choice best supports the idea that Jess is familiar with some of the customs that her mother's family observes? Okay, 23 to 26. Let's just mark those. 23 to 26. Okay, so these lines. 29 to 32. Okay, so this line, right? Then you have 42 to 46 and 59 to 63. 42 to 46 and 59 to 63. Okay, so Jess recognizes some of the customs that her family observes. Of course, she knew that Vorola was a Yoruba name, the name that her grandfather had asked in a letter for her to be called when her mother had held her Nigerian naming ceremony. So this could be the answer, right? The fact that she's aware that her mother had kept a Nigerian naming ceremony for her. So that is one of the customs that her family observes. So we'll keep this for now. But nobody had ever called her Vorola, not even her mother, whom she could now see from the corner of her eye, making anxious, silent gestures for her to go to her grandfather. So this is not about the custom, right? This is about Jess's familiarity with the name. So it can't be this. She could not make herself move forward, so she stayed where she was, avoided his touch, looked up into her grandfather's face, smiled and said quietly, but firmly in her most polite voice, "Hello, grandfather." So again, this does not have anything to do with the customs that her family follows. He had the same wide, strong jawline with the determined set as her mother and the same prominent cheekbones, although Jess could see that his were made angular more through the emaciation of age than anything else. Again, so this is the grandfather's description, physical attributes, has nothing to do with Nigerian customs. So it's option A. The main purpose of the description in lines 33 to 37 is to. So let's look at 33 to 37. Here, this one, right? Here in this stone-walled corridor where the sunlight came in through enormous stiff mosquito screens over every window and the clothes clung to her like another skin, Vorola sounded like another person, not her at all. So we discussed this while reading the passage, that it wasn't just the name that was unfamiliar to her, it was even the surroundings, right? This was, the Nigeria is a tropical country, has a lot of sun, so very different from Britain in that respect. Humid, so, the clothes clung to her. So this kind of accentuates the sense of outsiderness that Vorola felt. So it underscores Jess's philosophical musings by invoking a natural setting, suggests the correspondence between Jess's physical surroundings and her emotional state, portray Jess's thoughts about her Nigerian background through a nostalgic lens, reveal Jess's acceptance of her new life by depicting a common occurrence. So it's B, right? There is a correspondence, there is a correlation that those lines show between the physical surroundings and her emotional state. The fact that she feels out of place here. So this is not about her philosophical musings. I don't think her thoughts are philosophical musings. Those are just the natural reactions of a young person to a surrounding, to an environment that is alien to her. So it's not A. She is not looking at Nigeria through a nostalgic lens. She can't have a nostalgic lens. She's visiting Nigeria for the first time, so it's not C. And it's not about acceptance of her new life. It's, first of all, this is not her new life. She is visiting. It's not like she's going to settle here. or we don't know, right? Perhaps the family will settle, we don't know the rest of the story, but there's no evidence to suggest that this is her new life. So D is wrong. The series of questions in lines 38 to 41 serves primarily to portray Jess's 38 to 41. Okay, so these questions. Should she answer to this name and by doing so steal the identity of someone who belonged here? Should she become Verola, but how? So this kind of brings out Jess's dilemma, right? Her confusion at how to adopt an identity that she doesn't recognize, but that is definitely her at some level because she comes from that background. So the series of questions serve to portray Jess's confusion over her grandfather's attachment to his culture, her lack of familiarity with common Nigerian names, her concern about constructing a new sense of who she is, her uncertainty about the roles of other family members. So it's C, right? She is worried whether she should adopt this new identity. She has perhaps always looked upon herself as a British citizen, as a person who is culturally and in other ways British. But now, because she is in Nigeria, because her family is from Nigeria, she would need to construct that new identity and respond to Nigerian customs and Nigerian ways of being. So C is what captures that. It's not about her grandfather's attachment to his culture. She doesn't have anything to say about that. That is something that's quite obvious, that the grandfather relates to Nigerian culture. That's where he has spent his life. So that there's no confusion there. It's not about her lack of familiarity with common Nigerian names. It's about her lack of familiarity with Vurola, her Nigerian name, the fact that she doesn't answer to that name. And it's not about the roles that other family members play, right? It's about her identity as a Nigerian who lives in Britain. So it's C. Jess's second encounter with her grandfather differs from her first encounter because in the second encounter, Jess and her grandfather have a more private meeting. There are no family members around. So Jess must face her grandfather without support from other members of her family. Jess is more clearly startled by her grandfather's unpredictable behavior, has become more confident of her grandfather's ultimate approval, has little time to become acquainted with her grandfather before speaking to him. So it's A, right? This time the mother and the father are not around and she's going to spend time with the grandfather alone. So she must do that without support from other members of her family. She is not more clearly startled by her grandfather's unpredictable behavior. First of all, there's nothing unpredictable about the grandfather's behavior in the second meeting. In fact, he just sits on a chair or a sofa and she observes him and he observes her. So the sense of surprise is actually less compared to the first meeting. She is not more confident of his approval, right? That is something the passage leaves hanging. It ends on a note that, they are trying to decide what they feel about each other. So that confidence of his approval is not something the passage states. And she has little time to become acquainted with before speaking to him. No, in fact, that's not true either because they do sit in silence next to each other, observing one another before they speak. So it's not D. Question 10, as used in line 76, crisp most nearly means. So let's look at crisp, this word. She sat at a right angle from him, breathing out silence. He sat very upright, like her, she noted with surprise. His hands on his knees, the crisp lines of his white shirt almost molding him, fixing him still in her sight. So the crisp here refers to the shirt that he's wearing, right? The crisp lines of his white shirt. So let's look at the options. The sharp lines, right? The lines are sharp, The shirt is perhaps starched, and so there are sharp lines. Abrupt does not make sense in this context because the lines are crisp, which is to say the lines are sharp. They're not abrupt. Abrupt would mean that the lines occur anywhere, right? So A is wrong. Fragile cannot really be used for lines on a shirt. Fragile is used for something that can easily break. So this is wrong in context. And refreshing, how can lines on a shirt be refreshing, right? So this is also wrong. The right answer is C. Okay, so that was the literature passage. Let's grade it. Starting from 1. B, D, B, D, D, B, D, B, D, D. Number 6, A, B, C, A, C. A, B, C, A, C. Okay, great. So we got all correct. Hope this exercise helped you tackle this passage. If you go through the passage carefully, and particularly with literature passages, try and understand the connections between the characters and whether there is any metaphor employed in the passage, then the questions can be answered accurately without a problem. I will be uploading solutions to the other 4 passages in subsequent videos, so make sure you subscribe to the channel to receive notifications of those uploads. I'll see you guys soon. Take care. Bye-bye.